Okay. So it seems like you all have a pretty general understanding of what cross-ex is, right? It occurs right after each constructive speech for clarification, right, of what just happened. And then obviously, like, okay, so.
Just call me whatever.
Okay. As this gentleman over here was pointing out, it's also good to use for strategic purposes as well. So, what is CX? In theory, CX for you as a debater should equal more speech time when you're answering questions or asking them. When you're being asked questions, it should be a way for you to connect more with your judge in the sense where if there's something that they don't understand, this is your opportunity to make them even more familiar with your case than they were when you just first read it. So that's why it's very important. When you're actually asking the questions, you want to show your judge that not only do you have an understanding of their case, but you're not going to poke holes into their case. So in this way, when you use it for strategic purposes, that allows you to actually set up your rebuttals in future speeches. Because not only are you crossing out what you can use for your next speech, you're also trying to close doors on your opponents. It also allows you to kind of figure out what your opponent's going to need in order to extend out of his next speech to win. Right? In order for you to ask strategic questions, you not only have to know what it is that you need to win, right, when you're answering the questions, but you also need to be able to find out what is it that your opponent absolutely needs. What's the gateway into their 2AR? What is the gateway into their 2NR? That then you can then poke holes into and figure out.
Is this making sense to everyone? Audible yeses, please.
Yes.
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 Does anybody have questions? It's okay. You do. Okay? Cool.
So I'll give you a couple more seconds. But of course, it's an extension of your prep time, the bottom line. You get to ask during prep time. Not all of your circuits have, the luxury of flex prep, where you can take both your prep time and your cross-ex time at the same time, right? So you have to maximize every single second you have of your actual cross-ex 3 minutes in order to get the answers that you need so that you can prep for the responses in your next speech. Okay, what you don't want to do during CX. You do not want to spend more than 30 seconds clarifying. Now 30 seconds does sound maybe like a small amount of time, but in theory you should have an idea going into your speech, unless they spoke at a ridiculous rate of speed, and you really do need to break down line by line what just happened in the last 6 minutes or 4 minutes when they read their constructive. So you really should use your time to try to find the actual substance of the case. So outside of clarification, like what is your value? What is your criterion? Ask, how does your first contention actually meet your standard? Or why is it that I have to meet this burden that you set? Or what does that observation mean? Those questions are clarification type questions, but they have a purpose. They have some kind of end result that will help you in answering their case. And of course, for me as a judge, if a debater, if it wasn't, the case that the first debater that read the constructive read at a really, really fast pace and made it difficult to flow, if you do spend most of your time, asking clarification questions, it makes me as a judge think that you weren't flowing or you weren't paying attention. But of course, like I said, in cases where they read really, really fast, it might be the case where you have to go line by line. And we'll go into some of the good ways to deal with confusing positions using your CX a little later. But of course, when you're answering or when you're asking questions, it's very important that you don't be a jerk to your opponent. I know that it can get very heated, and they're trying to, your cases become your babies. You slave over them. You work so hard at making these case positions. So I know it's hard when you get called out on stuff that you think, no, my cases are fantastic. They are on lock. And then they ask you questions that make you feel like, oh, well, maybe my cases kind of suck. No, that's not an excuse to be a jerk, right? You have to be up there and confident in whatever it is that you're saying, either when you're the questioner or when you're on the receiving end.
Yeah, to add to that too, generally, if someone says something you find to be particularly offensive, the best way to play that situation is to chill actually and tell them that you found it offensive. Because most of the time, the judge is going to be receptive to that and not want to vote for them anyway. Now, that doesn't mean that they're automatically going to drop them, but it'll make the judge a lot more willing to listen to what you have to say in the next speech. That's just a suggestion.
What did Jelon, this happened during the demo debate. Can anybody remember what happened?
Ooh. Josh called the girl in his Goodman card a chick, or that chick, and he was just like, oh, let's not
Right.
handle it that way.
Right, the girl who Jelon described as being suicidal because of rehabilitative therapy was described casually as some chick, right? A lot of people will find that really offensive. We can go into other reasons about why that's offensive during lobby hours, see me.
Yeah, but the thing too is even from my perspective, even though I do think towards some women that would be offensive, I look good in front of the judges if I make that stand there, that's some sort of discourse I won't tolerate, because if I don't say anything, then it makes me look accepting of that. Basically, whatever position you argue, even though debating on both sides of an issue is fine, you still want to have some moral compass for what's right and what's wrong. And you wouldn't want people calling you a racial slur or saying something out of line. So you just need to make sure that you check and you tell debaters to be respectful if they're being disrespectful towards something you read or something that's personal to you. It's really important, and frankly, it's just good character for life. But
For sure. There's also a pattern in questioning that I would like for you all to avoid, which is sometimes you just know in your gut that there is something not right with their contention or the way that they're describing something, and you want to keep pressing them and pressing them on whatever it is that you don't feel comfortable with. Most of the time, if they are avoiding the question or not trying, to answer you directly, it's because they know it's that way too. One thing is, not letting it frustrate you and making it visibly frustrate you in front of the judge. But two, it's don't continue a line of questioning that you know is going nowhere. If the answer is still going to be circular and they're still going to keep telling you the same thing over and over again for the same question, move on to the next question. And maybe if you have extra time, come back to it and let it, kind of confuse them in that way. But don't continue pressing them on something that you know isn't going to come, you're not going to get the answer that you want. Do you have a comment? Seem like you're thinking, no?
to kind of build off that too, generally when people say something and they're not giving you the concession you want, the best thing you can do is smile and look at the judge. When you smile and look at the judge as they're saying that, it sort of gives the smiles are contagious, as the doctors say and whatnot. So if you smile at the judge as they're doing that, I assure you the judge, that sends a signal to the judge that you know what's going on and you won't go there. And the judge, if they smile back at you or give you some sort of confirmation that they know what's going on too, you've gone a long way to winning that argument. So whenever they don't want to give you the concession, just smile, maybe laugh about it a little bit and move on to the next question. It also makes you look really cool and control the situation.
Right. And off that, don't get really frustrated when someone's just being a mule, and by that I mean really, really obstinate about really obvious questions. One technique that we're going to teach you is to start from a really easily controlled spot and then move it into more open-ended to get that concession. So if I go up to Coral, I'm like, Coral, what color is the sky?
I don't really want to answer that.
And or she's
It might
like,
be yellow. I don't know.
and she's like, everyone has a different perception of the color scheme. I'll be like, okay, so what happens in the, so I move on, I say, okay, so what's the thesis of the lake?
That really sounds like a true answer. It's serious.
Jelon, this is why Jelon runs crazy things.
Yeah.
You're giving me a bad rep.
Okay, so don't let it just frustrate you, but you see how it's gonna be obvious, right? When you ask an obvious question and they're being a jerk about it. And that's gonna look bad on them and hurt speaker points. Because I, the judge, do not like it when people aren't being friendly with each other, or aren't being polite, or just being silly. Because they're they're so hard-line that they're refusing to answer a question. Does that make sense?
I think sometimes instances will come up in which individuals don't want to answer questions. I think from my judging perspective, I've seen it a couple of times. I think it'll benefit you more than it does them for them not to answer your question, because the judge will keep that in mind and will really give you a lot more credence on things you don't know about because they're, going around or being dishonest. That's really what it is. There's a difference between evading a question. There's a difference between giving them an answer they don't want. There's also a difference with lying, but, just straight up not answering it or being deliberate about that isn't really cool.
Yeah, and on either side, and I know this, if you've had debate experience, you know that sometimes you don't want to give a yes or no answer because there are questions that, in all actuality, you cannot just answer with yes or no. And oftentimes, you as the question asker may not like when they don't just give you a direct answer, like a yes or a no. But sometimes when you're on the receiving end and you just read your constructive and they're asking you questions, you feel like, well, no, that's not a question I can answer with just yes and no. I need to explain myself. And we'll show you what to say or how to handle those types of frustrating situations. Okay, what to do. When faced with confusing positions that maybe you don't understand, there are a couple quick tips that you can use and use your cross-X as a tool to get some things clarified and maybe give you a better shot at having a very strategic rebuttal. The first thing is to always ask for the thesis of the case. And thesis, just like in an essay for class, is the general concept or description of the position. So when you're asking for the thesis of their case, you just want to understand, okay, in general, what is it that the app world looks like? Or what does the neg world look like, according to your argumentation? Okay, I was going to say, you can also ask to hold the paper copy of their speech. And this, obviously, you have to do at the discretion of the way that your specific district functions. If it's not appropriate in your district, then don't do it, obviously. But if it is something helpful, or if they're working on a laptop, you can ask to borrow their laptop or have them flash you their speech so that you can actually dissect, maybe, especially if they're reading at a rapid rate, what it is that their position is and break it down that way. Something that it's very important to ask, even no matter what type of argument, but especially with confusing positions, is to ask if there are any pre-standard arguments. Does everyone know what pre-standard arguments are? Is there anyone that does not know what pre-standard arguments are? Okay.
Does somebody want to explain it in the audience?
Those of you who know what pre-standard arguments are?
What about the individual over here?
Yes, gentleman in the corner. You said you knew what pre-standard arguments are.
Me?
What are they?
I have a small idea.
Okay, what's
Go
your
for it.
small idea?
Okay, ones that don't really link into the standard, they're just general arguments.
Okay,
That's like 95% right.
they're related.
Yeah, here's a little secret. No argument is pre-standard. It just appeals to a higher standard than the one they're talking about.
But for my younger or less experienced, pre-standard means that a pre-standard argument comes before resolutional debate. So before we can even touch the substance of the debate, before we can talk about af and neg, we have to talk about this issue that defines the way that debate itself works. So a pre-standard argument comes before you read your speech, before you came into this room. There's this theoretical issue that we need to deal with. And if you don't win this theoretical issue, nothing that you read for the next 6 minutes or the next 42 minutes in a debate round is going to matter. Does that kind of make sense? And they're arguments that sometimes are very much not labeled the pre-standard argument number 1. They will be part of the framework at the very beginning of a case. And sometimes they won't even tell you that they're there. But what will happen is, in the second rebuttal, they'll say, uh-oh, my opponent forgot to actually, address this pre-standard. I'm going to extend it, game over, they lose. Everything else that they just extended, their impacts, their cards, they don't matter because my opponent didn't address this. So it's very important that in debate rounds, you ask and use that cross-X time to address whether or not there are any pre-standard arguments. Do you understand why that would be important? Does it clarify a little bit? It's not common in debate, but for the more advanced debaters, I've seen it peppered more in the debate community than when I was a debater, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely still happens a lot. Like she said, they just won't call it pre-standards. What they will do, though, is they'll take an argument that has nothing to do with any implication of a game over scenario with the ballot and exacerbate it into doing something big that had nothing to do with the 1AC. So even though you should ask if the argument comes pre-standard, a good thing to ask was, is there any reason to vote affirmative or to vote negative absent the criteria? If they don't have the answer for that, then, tell the judge, don't vote for the argument then, because they didn't tell you to vote for the argument in CX, because it doesn't link to the standard.
This links to a concept. This relates to a concept that that is really important. It has to do with fairness. What do we always say CX is?
Where you can establish what is fair game, pretty much.
Right. So CX has to be binding, right? Because rules can't be flexible, or they're not rules.
Yep.
Right. So that's a good way to if they can make a concession in CX, everybody know what concession is? Besides a delicious treat you can purchase at a baseball camp? No? Okay. Concession is an agreement to something. You yield to a certain argument and say, fine, that argument is true. If I press Coral, she said, fine, I agree, sky is blue. Right? And that is my argument. She's conceded to my argument. Make sense? Yes or no? Audible yeses?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, yeah. I don't remember.
Well, what things that you do want to do, and we've kind of just touched on some of them, is obviously be confident. Even if you don't really are 1,000% sure what it is that the arguments that are being read, it's important that you still stand up there and, in the professional attitude, do hold your head up high and ask the questions with conviction. Not like, oh, well, I guess, what's your criterion? What does that mean? You want to still speak confident, because that everything that you do from the moment that you step into the room to the moment that you leave is perceptually going to affect the judge. And so if I already think as a judge in the back of the room, before I've heard you speak or I've heard your speech, I think that you are not confident in what you're saying, what you say holds less value to me. And that's not a conscious decision that you make as a judge, but it's something that does happen. So it's important that you're confident. It's also important that you call them out on their BS. And literally, there are a lot of debaters out, especially in the national circuit, that run cases that are not warranted, that do not have, the appropriate sound logic to be a good case. But the debaters lose round after round, and they become incredibly successful for no real reason. All because debaters get, kind of intimidated by long words or, sexy jargon. You have to learn how to just treat every single argument like an argument, regardless of whether it's called a critique, regardless of whether it's called theory, regardless of whether it's called a counterplan. These are arguments. And when you're in CX, you have to treat them like arguments. Like, there is a claim, there is a warrant, there is an impact. Your job in CX is to isolate the links and the impacts to figure out what the arguments actually mean. And when you do that, your rebuttals, regardless again of how special the language is or what they're calling their arguments, you're still able to answer them substantively.
On that note, can I ask a question to everyone? If an author makes an argument with a claim, warrant, and an impact, does that automatically make the argument true?
No.
All right, let me ask you this. There are words on the paper, and there's an author name on top of them. Pittman 2 reads, right? And then there's that paragraph you wrote in the AC. What's the difference? Is there really a difference? The only real difference there is that they're introducing someone that's supposed to be qualified. But just because they're qualified doesn't mean that for certain types of arguments to believe theirs more than yours. Like in some instances, an analytical argument can be favorable to a badly written piece of evidence, right? A lot of the people that write evidence in academia are just professors that are hungry for tenure so they can get good health benefits. But so, when you're looking at these arguments, and you hear a card read, listen to the card precisely, because a lot of what you hear in the evidence is just full of assumptions and one little statistic, right? And also, when someone presents a piece of evidence and doesn't present the qualification, then it's really just like someone, presenting into the round offense or a card that says Warrior in 2011, right? Is it Becca or somebody that works at Baylor? If you don't know that information, just go straight at it. And don't give them a chance to.
These are also good CX questions if you cannot think of questions. Like, what are these authors' credentials? Like, most people aren't reading credentials, right? So you can be like, where does this source come from? How was this study conducted? Like, people
you have to also remember that a lot of the papers, like you are now in the research stage. The people that you are researching are not writing their, their papers or their whatever legal journals for debate, right? They're writing it because that is their career, to write these academic papers and to research these topics. So obviously, these debaters in general are cutting the evidence to appease whatever position or argument they're trying to make if it's not readily available in the article. So your job is to kind of figure out when is it that the debater is reaching, to make an argument true. When are they just cutting, too much into the evidence to make it, whatever it is that they want it to say. So that's very important. Another thing that you always want to do is ask for burdens for the af and the neg. I think it's going to be very important for this particular topic that you ask what the affirmative burden is. What does the affirmative have to do to win the round? What is a negative burden? What does the negative have to do to win the round? Or what will cause, a shift in ground? What will make the negative lose the round if you don't answer X argument? So those are very important questions to always ask, just so that the division of ground is clear from the moment that cross-examination occurs. We also want to identify similar arguments or similar warrants in the argumentation. This is very, very important because when you're doing your rebuttals, if there are implications that are similar, guess what you get to do when you're refuting? Group. And I know that we talked about during the demo debate about maybe some arguments not being able, not really appropriately grouped, but it's very important, it saves you time because you get to group a couple arguments and address them once versus going line by line and having to say the same thing over and over again. Oh, by the way, this impact doesn't really happen because I show that recidivism actually goes up, they're saying it goes down. The next argument is also that recidivism goes up, I'm saying it goes down. That's a waste of time, right? When you could very easily just say, group contention 1 and contention 2. My responses are 1, blah, 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 blah. That makes your life simpler and cleaner. And also just makes, the judge again feel perceptually that you're in control of the debate.
One thing I wanted to, well, you can
Go
go.
for it.
Yeah, I didn't really get to do too much of a spill on this one, but this
This
is
is
very
Joanne's
important.
favorite thing.
It really is. And that leads me to the key word. Whenever you have someone and you're asking them for a warrant, you all know how to read body language, right? Like, if you're talking to somebody, do you know how to tell if they're lying? Or if there's a good probability of them lying? What do? They're real fidgety. Sometimes they scratch their head. They do a lot of different things. Sometimes if they're fumbling over something, you might ask them a simple question like, what's the internal warrant within the Cohen evidence? And then they just read the tag or say the tag. And you're like, no, what's the warrant? And they're like, well, it means that recidivism goes down because of this, and I don't really understand your question, and then it's really, or is that your answer? And typically, they'll either say no, or they'll demonstrate clearly that they don't know what they're talking about. So, this applies to a lot of things. Unless it's an answer you want, never take the first answer, especially if they're nervous, because that means they're about to give you something juicier, or they're going to give you some demonstration that they don't know what it is. Then, if the situation's right, you can go all in.
So I want to talk a little bit, since we have a lot of differentiated age ranges, about how to do this in very simple ways. Because you guys are all really, really smart, even though we're all different ages, different grades, things like that. So you all know that the purpose of CX is to ask questions, right? But I'm sure you're all in here because you're wondering, how do I set up these questions? Now, so older kids, bear with me for just a little bit, if that's cool, and feel free to comment and help me out, okay? So, what is one thing, what are you supposed to have? What's the purpose of asking questions?
To get answers.
Right, so there's a purpose, right? You have a goal in CX, right? So when you're thinking of questions, I want you to think of a goal, right? What are some goals of CX? We already mentioned one, or mentioned a couple of them. What's the main one?
Find flaws.
Yeah, clarification and define flaws, right? So, first goal is to clarify, make sure you understand everything. Because you can't set up flaws in strategic arguments unless you understand things. So, make sure you understand things first. Then, connect with the judge, especially if you're answering questions, and point out flaws, things like that. So, how
kind of logical fallacy in it.
Right, so you just know something is wrong, right? But can I just go up to Jalon and be like, hey Jalon, do you have any logical fallacies?
No.
He's gonna be like, no, right? Like, that's not gonna make any sense. So I find that the easiest way to set up CX, and you guys also and especially what I like, is to start from a point of control, okay? Because CX is gonna be hard, and you're trying to lead people down a certain path, right? To get where things are. And has anybody ever read a Choose Your Own Adventure novel?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I used
right.
to read those in the Goosebumps series.
Right, the Goosebumps series, right? So in the Goosebumps series, everyone starts from page 1. That's a bit you don't choose your own adventure and be like, oh, I'm going to start on page 59, right? That doesn't make any sense. You start on the first page, and then you have options to go from there, just like a flow chart. So I usually like to start with a yes or no question after I've gotten all my clarification questions down. If they say yes, and it should be a question you know how they will answer, unless they're being a mule, right? In which case, you still get benefits from it. Is this making sense, everyone? So, you know where this is going to go. So there's not really a second option, right? But it's the first part of the link chain to lead to a second option where they can be put into a double bind, right? Either something is true or something is false, right? What's the Jolene, can we tell them what happened with McDonald's the other day?
I don't remember.
You don't
Are
remember?
you talking about when they didn't give me my ranch sauce?
No. I'm talking about when, so John made a statement that was like, I wish I could go running tonight with Courtney at 2. And I was like, isn't that dangerous?
Oh.
And he was like, yeah, I guess it would be for Courtney. And I was like, so basically.
I hit a moment of realization that I had forgot where I was.
Yeah. Do you want to explain a little more?
I don't think it needs to.
Okay, so, yeah. So, the idea is that, I tracked him, right? Because I'd be like, he answered a very obvious question, and then came upon the realization that was like, oh, I forgot about this, right? And that happens all the time. So, you do that by starting at a point of control, right? I know what he's going to say, so then I can really already put him in the trap. Go for it.
I think with something like that too, you can ask a yes or no question, but sometimes I think a more aggressive approach into getting an answer you may want directly without having to jump through hoops is asking them to specifically explain a specific reason for why a warrant is good and a piece of evidence. And that, you don't ask them that by saying, what is the warrant? You say, the Johnson evidence falls upon the assumption that recidivism is good. Based upon that, what rhetoric or what does he say? What do you say rhetorically to prove that conclusion is correct? And they have to do two things then. They either have to A, concede your assumption that Johnson says his conclusion is good, which is a sneaky way of getting them to accept your characterization of their argument. And that's damning, because if they do that, then you essentially control what the claim of their argument is for the rest of the round. And B, normally a lot of people don't know their stuff, so they're going to ramble on about it. But if you ask questions like that authoritatively, it's very coercive for them, because you're not asking them about their cards or their cases if you didn't hear it before. You're asking them that from a position of, oh yeah, I probably cut this evidence before. Explain to me that you know what you're talking about.
So, the two important steps is to have a goal and to have a plan. And then a backup plan if that plan falls through. And not to get frustrated or stay too long on one question. Another thing that's important is as soon as you achieve that goal, don't linger on it. Right? Because that just makes you look like a jerk. Unless do you disagree? I mean, I as a judge hate it. I hate it as a judge when people are like, oh, I got you to concede the link to my K or my DA, ha 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 ha. Let's keep on talking about how much you conceded to my DA. You got the concession. CX is binding. Don't waste the time.
I think sometimes if you get someone and you smile at the judge, again, the judge gets on board with it, and you should always perhaps take 1 one step after you've gotten the concession necessary so that you can free up offense for the next speech, i.e., all I'm saying is this. Say if you get the concession you want, you got it. You wanted it for a reason. The reason may be so you can gain access to something else. Why don't you just go for that, and if they try to take it back, you admit that they made this concession, right? Because if they make the concession, what they said sets your offense in stone. A lot of times, some people will just bite in and nip it in. But if they don't, the judge will take characteristic of how they're physically reacting to your line of questioning, and then they'll look more like a mule. But you've got your concession anyway. I think in a few cases, sometimes getting the concession and leaving quickly can demonstrate to a judge that you're afraid sometimes to be a little bit more aggressive or under-aggressive than you should. But like Becca's saying too, there are also instances in which you may get a concession and then you shouldn't go any farther because it will muddle the fact that you got it in the first place.
Right. So it all depends on you making that connection with the judge, just like Coral talked about, right? So if you can tell the judge, like, it's like, oh, they just made a concession, right? Usually, most judges are very, very, like, emotive, right? And use this to your advantage. Like, I especially am very, very emotive. Does everyone know what I mean by emotive? Yeah? Audible, yes. Okay, they display their emotions easily, so you can know whether or not what they're thinking.
It's like if you say something accurate about women's rights, she'll be happy.
I'll be like, yeah, right? Or if you say something like, women belong in the kitchen and unless they're in heels vacuuming, I'll be like that, right? And so, and then you can even like look with them. You should be doing this. And so like, if you, so like if you've made that, if you've gotten the concession or made your goal, and you recognize that the judge has seen that you've reached your goal, you can move on. Right? Because at the end of the day, who is the most important person in the room?
Judge.
Right, exactly. And they're not a robot. So you have to make sure that they're understanding what you're going for.
Yeah, and I mean, some simple ways that you could do this and still feel like you're getting to a good place, even if you feel like you ran out of questions, is to continue asking why and how. And show me where such and such author says this. Show me specifically the rhetoric in the card that explains this, extrapolation you're making. Because they're going to make claims of, well, Johnson says that if we don't rehabilitate criminals, there's going to be nuclear war. I don't know what to tell you. That's just what he says. Ask him, where exactly does Johnson say this? And that way, one, you show the judge, listen, if you want to call the card, you can call the card at the end of the round, but it does not say what this person is saying. And that's already something else that you can add to your rebuttal and in following speech. But if they struggle in explaining specific rhetoric out of, their cards or their analytics that say what they're representing in their speech, then that's a problem. And that becomes an immediate red flag for me as a judge. I'm probably going to call whatever card you're saying is problematic, just so that I know in my mind, is it really, what the initial constructive said, or is it what the opponent is now claiming? So, I mean, using why can help reveal warrants or the lack of warrants. Asking how can reveal impacts or the lack of impacts. How is it that such argument leads to X? Or how is it that such argument is, why is such argument true? That way you can also find holes without necessarily planning what it is that you have. It'll be kind of like a backup plan. But it's your way to actually get a substantive answer or something that you can write down. We kind of touched on some of the special circumstances that can occur during CX when you're asking someone a question or you're on the receiving end of questioning. If they begin to take over CX by not allowing you to respond or speak, you can politely say something like, may I finish answering your question? Or I really can't answer that question with a yes or no. Or, still show that you are the professional and that you are in control. Because again, as a judge, I am taking in every single body language, every single physical cue that you're putting out there, I'm interpreting. And it helps with obviously your perception that you're shaping with me and also your opponent. Go ahead.
Okay. Another thing, well, go ahead and never lose control.
Okay, yeah.
I was right, so I can hear you.
Okay. Never lose your cool if they become extremely aggressive. This shows the judge that you're still in control. Again, if they start yelling and getting, carrying on out of hand, That is your job then to show that you're the professional, that you can stay in control, and that their actions do not affect you. You're still going to continue answering their questions or making the questions.
Yeah, one thing I like to say too about CX, and I might be one of the outliers in the community on this opinion, the CX may be named the affirmative or the negative, but I think truly that only indicates or lends itself to the notion that that's the person that's supposed to ask the questions, right? The 3 minutes is up for grabs, right? Someone might say, this is my CX, this is my time to ask the questions. Your response needs to be, it's true you get to ask them, but you cannot dictate how I answer your questions or the depth of the response I give towards answering your questions. Just because they're asking them, don't let them control it and cut your questions short, you know. You have to fight and try to speak for as much of the 3 minutes as you can, because that's really extra speech time. If you're an AF and a negative is asking clarifications, you know, for the next 3 minutes, essentially you've spoken about your AC for 8 minutes instead, or 9 minutes instead of 6. So don't let the name of the call sex fool you. You want to try to dominate and take over each one, being respectful. In the situation Crowell talked about, if they're yelling or, you know, they're answering your questions way too long, I think it's also very appropriate to not smile, but to just not say anything and stand there sometimes. And then they'll ramble and there'll be an awkward silence. And then the judge may laugh about it and you can go on to the next one. Sometimes people make the bad mistake of over-answering questions. And then they give you a concession somewhere along the line that you may not have expected that will benefit you later on.
So one thing that Jalon is kind of hitting at that I really want to talk about is balance, okay? So how not to appear like a jerk, but how also to appear assertive, right? Because dominance, winning is dominating over someone else. There's no other way to put it, right? And so, but you don't want to like associate the connotations of dominance by winning. And by that I mean you don't want to act like a jerk, right? So one thing that's really good to do is to learn your strengths. When I was a debater, I was not funny at all. I don't know if you can tell how unhumorous I am, but like very serious. So I would make jokes about how I was not funny, right? Like, or like tell a really lame joke and then be like, oh, that's awkward, right? And then it would make the judge plead, because remember what Mr. Timmons said? We are so bored, not bored. We are so tired by
And board sometimes.
sometimes bored, right? Of judging. Like, because you do 1 round, we watch 2 rounds, right? You only stand up for half the time, we pay attention to all the time.
You're tired from eating all the food.
Yeah, and then we have like turkey in the judges lounge, and that has like,
Crabs and whatnot.
what?
Crabs,
I don't know where judges lounge you're going to.
Green Hill.
I'm lucky if I get pizza.
Whatever, Green Hills in the judges lounge, okay?
They do.
So, anyway, so you want to play to your strengths and figure out what that is. Now, sometimes for girls, or for people who aren't necessarily as like openly or physically dominant, like if I am standing next to Jalon, who do you think is more dominant? That's the right answer. But
You intimidate me.
what?
You intimidate me more. I'd actually not.
So if we stand up straight and like we were actually debating, like who would you think is physically more dominant?
Based upon primary like stereotypical assumptions, you automatically assume that the male is more dominant. But I think that would be like a fallacy.
I agree, it's a fallacy. But I'm saying like,
Ron seems really, really chill, so it's
Yeah,
hard
like,
to
I-
understand Jalon.
I think right now your demeanor is like you're more rigid, whereas Jalon is more relaxed. So again, I would assume that you have more dominance.
okay,
I think even when, I think we need to though be careful upon the conclusion that relax correlates with non-dominance. I mean, I think Rebecca's referring to the physical features here.
yeah, I was talking about like height. Like
Oh.
before questions had been asked.
Like who's
That's
gonna,
why I was like, I'm not talking about like male or
like
female.
who's
Like,
gonna win a fight type stuff.
yeah. Right, like I might know karate, right? But you don't know that until I start acting, right? And people do have stereotypes, people do have assumptions. And part of being persuasive and winning is using those things, right? And using them to your advantage. And I'm not saying like, not like to like the extreme advantage, that's like really bad, but like just balance, right? Play to your strengths. So what might be good for someone is to ask, like, to be someone, like, if I, like, there's a really good debater on a circuit, right? He wins every tournament, or she wins every tournament, and they're amazing, and they're actually a really good person, right? A really good debater. But they're so used to winning, right, and running all these complicated, critical arguments that they're not used to having people really, like, they're used to having people answer, like, ask, like, weird, like, clarification questions, right? So you can put them off their guard by starting in that place. That's another way of controlling them, right? Like, I'd be like, what's an example? I can't think of an example. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. One thing, could you stand here for a second?
Yeah.
All right. So she just finished reading her AC, right? And I'm sitting down. So we start cross-sections. So what's the warrant of the A?
The warrant is that ice cream activates more taste buds
Right.
than salad.
So based off of this right here, do I still look more dominant than she does? Or do I just like, I'm on my chill, I'm not even suited up, I'm just here because I had to be here for the weekend, I really just don't care. Now, if I stand up, and I'm like, so could you give me the internal warrant within the evidence of the third contention that talks about recidivism?
It's
No, the specific argument right above the kind of.
It's a meta-analytical study compiled from, I don't know what Josh said. I don't.
Meta-analytical studies?
Yeah, it's a study of studies.
All right, where are all the studies?
There are 10 conducted by Stanford, 15 conducted by Harvard.
What were the results of one of the studies?
I don't have the specific results, I have the cumulative results,
So why does it matter?
because it's cumulative.
Cumulative of what?
There's more studies being, like, copied, John, I don't understand, like,
What is
problem
what is the framework for how you evaluate the studies? What makes them all similar?
Off simile?
All similar.
Oh, all similar.
Yeah.
I mean, they each control, like, they each account for the same variables, and...
You sure about that?
Yeah,
So if they're all the same, then why can't you tell me the result of one study?
because they're based on different people, so the percentages
So then
vary.
they're not the same.
I mean, they all came to the same result, but one has majority and one doesn't.
Anyone see anything going on there?
I don't play.
But did anyone also see the difference between me sitting down versus me standing? When you stand up, you automatically apply a sense of seriousness because you're physically getting up to do something. I think for cross-examination, you should always stand up. But that's just me personally.
And as a judge, when I see you taking it seriously, I appreciate that, because I am hanging out at a debate tournament, even though I'm like 22 years old, right? Instead of like hanging out with my friends, right? So I think there's something serious about the activity, so I want you guys to take it seriously.
Did anyone else also notice anything else on the side about that exchange me and Becca just had? Anyone notice anything?
Fidgeting,
Huh?
a lot of fidgeting.
Well, I don't have an argument, he just gave some sort of...
Anyone notice anything else? Anything rhetorically she did?
Well, your attitude went from more serious to looser. You started loosening up because you were unsure.
Yeah,
Right. What does that mean to you?
She's
when you see
uncomfortable. She,
Right.
she doesn't know how to answer the question.
that? Exactly. You have to be able to read body language like that. Also, on my end, see, I really firmly believe that 50% of debate is accurate. But
Oh.
you have to be able to switch it up, right? Like you have to be able to be really serious about asking questions and then just morph one into a joke on the fly.
Yeah.
Because those things really benefit you perceptually, but they also sometimes can politely undermine what people are trying to do.
right, because then I get flustered because I'm like laughing, I lose my train of thought. Or like, I feel embarrassed because people laughing at me instead of near me. Or like, Jolan is funnier than I am.
I don't know about that.
Okay. But does any, so, how much time do we have left? You have to hit the top button.
Ooh, we got 7 minutes.
Okay, that answered that question.
So let's just, to wrap up, I guess, the presentation portion, obviously CX will likely not win you debates on their own, but they will definitely be important in shaping the strategy for you to win the debates, i.e. by allowing you to poke holes into your opponent's cases. But also remember that anything that you say, like they've kind of mentioned, is anything you say during cross-ex is binding. I mean, at least it is for me as a judge. Maybe someone's paradigm isn't that it is binding, but in my opinion, anything that you say in CX is binding, and you should be able to reference. Remember when they conceded that, or remember when they described that, is also very helpful because it allows you to have something outside of the actual speech proper to use as rebuttal, substance, versus, well, their first contention said. Remember when they described their first contention as saying X. And also, of course, like we said before, CX is money in the bank. It is additional seconds of prep time. It's additional seconds of speech time. So it's very important that you treat it that way. Some important tips for you to have moving forward is to ask your teammates and or coach to CX you before tournaments. Just read your cases and have them ask you general questions, because usually their first reaction to your cases and the first questions that pop into their minds is probably the first question that's going to pop into your opponent's mind, related to your specific case, of course. Obviously, the longer that you debate, the more that you'll realize whether there are holes in your own case because your opponents keep asking you the same questions, or you start realizing that there's a general consensus about the way some arguments function, and that way you can shape and adjust your CX questions accordingly. If you realize that Sheffer card actually isn't warranted, but everyone is using it, you now know what to zero in on during your CX questions. Also, read your cases to yourselves and ask those hows and whys and where does so-and-so say to yourself, and see if you can actually fill in those blanks, because if you're reading it and you can't answer the whys or the hows for yourself, then those whys and hows are probably missing, and those are holes that your opponents will exploit rather than you the other way around.
I think too, the topic comes out about a month before you actually have to debate it. People in the circuit underutilize this, but you should be prepping questions to ask before you get to the tournament. And they should be very strategic questions that you've thought about, because the more questions you have prepared that are specific to certain scenarios, like a Supreme Court case, right? Say if you get a Supreme Court case that's like Roper versus Simmons, and it's a 5-4, which means it's relatively close. You should be able to ask your opponent who's advocating in agreement with that position or with that case, why did certain judges vote a certain way? Don't just give me the court summary, right? Why did Scalia vote this way? Why did Thomas vote this way? What was the logic in the way they determined the way they voted? Because sometimes the logic of certain things in one card or one piece of evidence may be inconsistent throughout the case. But if you don't read or know to ask those questions, you won't find out.
So one thing also is, when you are thinking of these questions, make sure you yourself know how to answer them and know the answers, because if you think of the question, you all have great minds and great minds think alike. Somebody else is going to have the question too. Okay? Do we have questions? Oh, Jayla.
Any?
If you guys want to do drills tonight, I know I will be available in the lobby. I'm thinking they will be too, at least for a little bit.
I'm always in the lobby.
I know.
Well, there's an all around the world CX game she raised about that's really cool.